12 years of my life, gone in a single meeting. One minute I was sitting at the polished mahogany boardroom table, thinking we were about to discuss quarterly profits, and the next my wife's sister, now sitting in the CEO chair, was smirking at me like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. "We've decided your services are no longer required," she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "And just to twist the knife," she added, "it's for the best. You've been too emotionally involved in the company." I knew exactly what that meant, emotionally involved with my wife, the daughter of the man who built this $120 million empire. The same man who trusted me to run it when he got sick. Before I could speak, she dropped the real bomb. "I think it's important to tell you this isn't personal, but my boyfriend agrees it's time for a change." Her boyfriend. The man she'd been sneaking into late-night strategy meetings. The man who'd never lifted a finger for the company. The man I'd caught once in the executive gym bragging about how he'd run the place soon. I could feel every eye in the room watching me, waiting for me to explode, to beg, to crumble. But instead, I smiled. Not a bitter smile, a genuine one. Because unlike her, I knew something she didn't. Tomorrow was going to be fun. If you've ever been stabbed in the back by family or watched power-hungry people think they've won, stick around, because you're about to see what real payback looks like. This is where it gets interesting. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. "Well," I said calmly, "thank you for making this so clear." My wife's sister tilted her head, clearly expecting me to argue. But I didn't. I simply slid my company access badge across the table and walked out, without another word. The thing is, she thought firing me was the end of the story. What she didn't know was that I'd been quietly preparing for this for months. I'd noticed the coincidences, contracts mysteriously diverted to companies tied to her boyfriend, suppliers suddenly cutting ties unless they dealt with her directly. I'd even overheard a drunken conversation at the last corporate retreat where she bragged to one of her friends about how she'd make Daddy's company hers once I was out of the way. What she never suspected was that every shady deal, every manipulated decision, every violation of corporate policy, I documented it. Every single one. Dates, names, amounts, even voice recordings. And it wasn't just me who had the dirt. A few of the senior managers, loyal to her father, not her, had quietly slipped me information when they realized what was happening. Walking out of that boardroom, I didn't feel like a man who'd lost everything. I felt like a man holding a live grenade. And tomorrow, I'd be pulling the pin right in the middle of their perfect little empire. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was stressed, but because I was too busy fine-tuning my plan. At 8 a.m. sharp, the company's annual shareholder meeting would start. My wife's sister, freshly crowned CEO, would be on stage giving her big victory speech, thinking she'd finally secured her position. And I would be sitting in the audience, smiling like a man with nothing to lose. I made a few calls before sunrise. The first was to my lawyer, who confirmed that the evidence I'd collected wasn't just damaging, it was explosive. We had proof of embezzlement, fraud, and multiple breaches of fiduciary duty. The second call was to a trusted reporter I'd known for years, someone who loved a scandal, especially when it involved the rich and powerful. By the time the meeting started, she'd already booked her photographer and was waiting in the lobby, hungry for a headline. When I arrived at the venue, I could see the tension in my wife's sister's eyes. She clearly hadn't expected me to show up, much less dressed in my sharpest suit with a stack of sealed envelopes under my arm. My wife sat beside her, avoiding my gaze, as if she already knew the storm was coming. The first 20 minutes of the meeting were dull corporate fluff. Then came the questions from shareholders segment, my moment. I stood up slowly, cleared my throat, and addressed the entire room. Before we continue, I said, I think the shareholders deserve to see what's been happening behind the scenes. After all, it's their money. Dozens of heads turned toward me. My wife's sister's smile froze, and she gripped the podium like she was bracing for an earthquake. She had no idea. The earthquake had already started. I walked down the aisle toward the stage, the click of my shoes echoing in the tense silence. Every pair of eyes followed me as I reached the podium and set the stack of envelopes down. These, I said, tapping them lightly, are copies of documented transactions, emails, and voice recordings showing how millions of company dollars were redirected to shell businesses owned by. I paused just long enough for the crowd to lean in. Our CEO's boyfriend. A ripple of gasps shot through the room. My wife's sister's face went pale. She tried to cut in, her voice trembling. That's a lie, but I held up a finger. I'm not finished. I reached into the stack and pulled out glossy photos. Her boyfriend at a luxury resort in Dubai, sipping champagne with a woman who was most definitely not her. The photos had timestamps. The dates matched up perfectly with business trips. Billed to the company. Her boyfriend, seated near the front, shifted uncomfortably as whispers swirled through the crowd. One of the senior shareholders stood up, glaring at her. Is this true? He demanded. She stammered, reaching for the microphone, but before she could respond, I hit play on a small recorder. Her voice filled the hall. He doesn't need to know the details. Just get the contract signed, and I'll make sure you're compensated. We can hide it in the marketing budget. The board members looked like they'd been slapped. The shareholders were snapping photos, recording videos, sending texts faster than she could blink. And in that moment, I knew she was done. She just didn't know how done yet, because the real twist, the one that would end her career and her relationship in the same breath, was still sitting quietly in my briefcase. And I was going to drop it right when she thought the nightmare couldn't get worse. I let the recording end, then calmly slid a final envelope from my briefcase. This, I said, holding it up, is a full forensic audit conducted by an independent firm. It details exactly how $14.6 million vanished from company accounts over the past 3 years. The transfers lead to personal accounts belonging to... I glanced at her boyfriend, whose face was now drenched in sweat. Both of you. The room exploded. Shouts, accusations, and the frantic clicking of phones filled the air. My wife's sister tried to shout over the chaos, insisting it was a smear campaign, but the shareholders weren't buying it. One of them, an older man who had invested since the company's early days, stood and declared, I'm calling for an emergency vote to remove her as CEO immediately. The room roared in agreement. I stepped away from the podium, watching, as she frantically whispered to my wife, begging her to do something. My wife, to her credit, didn't move. She just stared at me with wide eyes, realizing that everything she'd chosen to align herself with was burning down in front of her. Security approached her boyfriend, who tried to slip out the side door. Bad move. The reporter I'd called was waiting there with a cameraman, catching every second of his red-faced exit. Within minutes, the board voted her out, stripped her of all decision-making power, and froze her access to company accounts. As the meeting adjourned in chaos, I simply walked to the back of the room, where the reporter greeted me with a smirk. "I think we have our front-page story," she said. I just nodded, but I wasn't done, not even close. Because the next phase of my plan was going to make today look like a warm-up. That evening, I sat in my office with a glass of whiskey, watching the chaos unfold online. The story had already gone viral. Headlines about the CEO caught in multi-million-dollar scandal were plastered across business news sites, and the leaked photos of her boyfriend in Dubai were trending on social media. The company's stock had taken a nosedive, and investors were demanding answers. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from former colleagues, all of them thanking me for finally exposing the truth. Some even confessed they'd known shady things were happening but were too afraid to speak up. I didn't reply. I wasn't looking for praise. I was looking for the final nail in her coffin. At around 9 p.m., my lawyer called. "It's official," he said. The board filed a lawsuit against her and her boyfriend for fraud. They're freezing all their personal assets pending investigation. I swirled my drink, letting that sink in. The same woman who had smirked at me while signing my termination papers was now facing prison time. Then came the call I'd been waiting for. My wife. Her voice was shaky. "We need to talk." "Please." I let the silence drag before saying, "Tomorrow, noon, my office." She tried to say more, but I ended the call, because tomorrow wasn't about reconciliation. It was about showing her exactly what happens when you choose greed over loyalty. And I had something waiting for her that would shatter the last illusion she had about her perfect little world. The next day, she walked into my office wearing oversized sunglasses, her hair tied back like she was trying to hide from the world. I didn't even offer her a seat. I just slid a thick envelope across the desk. She hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. Inside were printed screenshots of bank transfers from her personal account to her sister's offshore fund. Transfers I'd found months ago and quietly documented. Along with them was a photo of her boyfriend in a luxury suite with her sister. Her face went pale. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp. "The same place I got the recording of your sister bragging about firing me to make room for her man. That recording is already with the board and the IRS." She sank into the chair, her sunglasses slipping off. For the first time in years, she looked small. "You don't understand, I cut her off. "I understand perfectly. You thought you could destroy me and walk away clean. But you forgot something. I built this empire. I know every secret, every number, every weakness." She tried to plead, but I stood up and opened the door. "We're done. And when you walk out of here, you'll realize something. You just lost everything. And I haven't even started." Her heels clicked against the floor as she left, but I could tell her steps were unsteady. Because she knew Tomorrow's headlines weren't going to be any kinder than yesterday's. That evening, I made one final move, the one that would erase any chance of her crawling back into the corporate world. I sent an anonymous tip to a well-known investigative journalist, attaching every document, every photo, every timestamp I'd collected. I didn't just send her sister's crimes. I sent my wife's to dot by morning. The expose hit like a thunderclap. The headline was brutal. Family empire crumbles. $120 million company in fraud, nepotism, and scandal. The article detailed everything. The secret accounts, the trips, the affairs, and even the way they tried to oust me. My name appeared only as a former executive who provided key evidence, but everyone in the industry knew exactly who it was. Within hours, their faces were splashed across every major news channel. The luxury cars, the penthouse apartment, the designer clothes, all of it was being seized. The boyfriend had already fled the country, but not before draining the last accessible account, leaving my wife's sister broke and humiliated. As for my wife, she sent me a single text, "You ruined me." I stared at it for a long moment, then typed back 2 words, "You started." I walked away from my desk, knowing I'd finally closed that chapter. And as I stepped outside into the sunlight, I couldn't help but smile. The empire I built might have been stolen, but I'd just proven who the real power had always been. And now I was free to build something even bigger without them. A week later, I was sitting in the corner booth of a quiet cafe, sipping my coffee, when an all-too-familiar figure walked in, my wife's sister. She spotted me instantly and froze, clearly debating whether to turn around and leave. But pride got the better of her. She marched over, her designer handbag replaced with a cheap tote, her diamond necklace gone. "I hope you're happy," she spat, her voice low but venomous. "You destroyed everything." I set my cup down and looked at her evenly. "No," I said calmly. "You destroyed everything. I just told the truth." She leaned closer, her eyes flashing. "You'll regret this. People like me, we rebuild. We always do." I smiled faintly and slid my phone across the table. On the screen was a draft of a second article, scheduled to publish in 48 hours, containing even more evidence I hadn't released yet. "Maybe you will," I said, "but you won't rebuild if this goes live." Her mouth opened, then closed. She took a step back, suddenly unsure. I picked up my coffee again, my voice light. "Walk away. Stay quiet." "And I won't have to use it." She didn't reply. She just turned and left, her shoulders tense, like she finally understood the truth. She wasn't in control anymore. And as the cafe door swung shut behind her, I realized something. Revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about making sure they never had the power to hurt you again. 2 months later, I got an unexpected invitation. The board of the company I'd built was calling me back for a private meeting. At first, I thought it was some sort of joke. But the letter was real, signed by the interim chairman himself. When I walked into that conference room, every face turned toward me. Some were ashamed, others curious, but all of them knew I was the reason the company had survived the public scandal without collapsing entirely. The chairman cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the damage and your role in protecting our assets," he said. "We'd like you to return. Not as an employee, as the new CEO. For a moment, I almost laughed. The same title my wife's sister had stolen from me was now being handed back on my terms. But I didn't give them an answer right away. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "I'll consider it," I said. "If every corrupt executive involved in this mess is gone, permanently." The chairman nodded immediately. "Done." As I left the building, I saw my wife's sister outside the gates, protesting with a small group, her voice hoarse from shouting. Our eyes met for just a second, and she knew the company was mine again. But this time, I wouldn't be building it for them. Tomorrow, I'd step back into the empire I created. But today, I was going to enjoy the victory they swore I'd never have. 3 days into my return as CEO, I called for an all-hands meeting in the Grand Hall, the same place they once held a party to celebrate my departure. Back then, I was humiliated in front of hundreds. Today, the stage was mine. I walked up to the podium, the room buzzing with tension. Cameras were rolling for the company archive, just like before. I scanned the crowd and spotted her, my wife's sister, sitting in the back, pretending she belonged there. Without breaking eye contact, I began. A year ago, this company nearly collapsed. Not because of market forces, not because of competition, but because of greed and betrayal from within. A ripple went through the audience. I paused for a beat, letting the silence work in. My favor. Some of you stood by while good people were pushed out. Some of you helped make that happen. And I want you to know, I remember every single one of you. The room was still. Even the sound tech stopped moving. Then I smiled. Slow, deliberate. From this day forward, we rebuild. But we rebuild with loyalty, integrity, and respect. And for those who can't live by that, I looked toward the security guards posted at the door. Leave your badges on the table and go. 5 people stood up and walked out, including one executive who'd once cheered the loudest when I was fired. The applause that followed wasn't just for the speech. It was for the shift in power. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just taken my position back. I'd taken back the soul of the company they tried to destroy. That night, after the meeting, I went home to a quiet apartment, afar. Cry from the mansion I used to share with my wife. I thought I'd feel empty, but instead, there was a strange peace. I poured myself a drink and stepped out onto the balcony, looking over the city lights. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was her, my wife. Her voice was low, almost timid. I heard about the meeting, and that you're CEO again. I miss you. I didn't say a word, just let her voice hang there in the night air. Then she added, we should talk. Maybe we can fix things. I almost laughed, but instead I asked, and your boyfriend? Is he okay with that? She went silent for several seconds before saying, that's over. He was using me. I took a slow sip of my drink. You both were using me, I said finally. The difference is, I learned from it. You didn't. Her tone turned desperate. Please, just dinner. One chance. I glanced at the city skyline, remembering every insult, every betrayal, every smirk when they thought I was finished. No, I said quietly and ended the call. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. Tomorrow, the headlines would talk about my comeback. But tonight, I was just a man who'd finally closed a chapter that should have ended a long time ago. 2 weeks later, the story hit the news, not about me, but about her. A major business magazine published an expose on my wife's sister and her leadership. Leaked emails, insider testimonies, and financial records showed the reckless deals she'd made to please her boyfriend, costing the company millions before my return. I didn't leak the files. I didn't have to. When you burn enough bridges, someone else will happily light the match. The fallout was brutal. Her reputation in the corporate world disintegrated overnight. She lost not only her position on the board, but also her seat on 3 other companies. Where she served as a director. My wife called again, voice trembling this time. She's falling apart. People are cutting her off. She blames you. I chuckled softly. She should thank me, I replied. If I wanted revenge, she wouldn't just be jobless. She'd be bankrupt. There was silence, then a shaky breath on the other end. And what about me? She asked. I thought about that for a moment. You made your choice years ago, I said, and hung up. As I put my phone down, I realized the sweetest part wasn't the payback, the CEO title, or even the applause in the boardroom. It was knowing I'd rebuilt everything they tried to destroy without ever needing them again. Months later, life had settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. The company was thriving, my team was loyal, and the noise of the past had finally faded into the background. One crisp autumn morning, I was on my way into the office when security stopped me at the lobby. Sir, she's here, one guard said cautiously. I turned to see my wife, or rather, the woman who used to be my wife, standing there in an expensive coat, makeup done, but eyes hollow. She walked toward me slowly, clutching a folder. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for everything. I thought I'd win when I betrayed you. I lost everything instead. Please, I just want you to know I regret it. I looked at her for a long moment. This was the same woman who once threw my years of work aside without a second thought. Now she was just a shadow of that arrogance. I took the folder from her hands. Inside was a letter, not for me, but for the board, resigning from all claims to family shares and company ties. Why give this to me? I asked. She swallowed. Hard, because I don't deserve any of it. And I know you'll make better use of it than I ever could. I nodded, said a simple goodbye, and walked past her into the elevator without looking back. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the metal, standing alone in the lobby, finally facing the cost of her choices. That day, I signed the letter, filed it with the board, and locked the last door to my past. I didn't need revenge anymore. I'd already won, and the life ahead of me was worth far more than anything I'd lost.